Marcus Chen stepped off the transport ship and looked up at the massive towers of the Galactic Naval Academy. The buildings stretched so high into the sky that their tops disappeared into the clouds. Everything was made from a strange blue metal that seemed to glow in the alien sunlight. He had never seen anything like it on Earth. The Academy was on a planet called Kepler 442b, far from his home. Marcus was the first human ever to study here. The thought made his stomach feel tight with worry. He picked up his bag and walked toward the main entrance. Other students moved around him, but they were not human. Some looked like tall, thin people with blue skin and 4 arms. Others were made of what looked like living crystal that caught the light and threw rainbows everywhere. There were bug-like creatures that clicked when they walked, and some students seemed to be made of glowing gas that floated instead of walking. Marcus felt very small and very different. A tall blue alien approached him. She had kind eyes and spoke in perfect English. "You must be Lieutenant Chen from Earth. I am student leader Korath. I will show you to your classes." "Thank you," Marcus said. His voice sounded loud in his own ears. Korath led him through halls filled with students from 12 different species. The walls showed moving pictures of space battles and famous ships. Marcus tried not to stare, but everything was so strange and wonderful. "Do not worry," Korath said as they walked. Everyone was nervous on their first day. Even those of us who have been traveling between stars for thousands of years. They stopped at a large classroom with a curved ceiling that looked like the inside of a bubble. About 30 students sat in chairs that seemed to float in the air. At the front of the room stood the teacher. Professor Veltar was a Zephyrian, one of the blue 4-armed aliens. He was very old and very respected. His species had been building warships longer than humans, had been using metal tools. When he spoke, his voice was deep and musical. "Today we will study the finest examples of naval engineering in the galaxy," Professor Veltar announced. He waved one of his hands, and the air above his desk began to glow. Slowly, a perfect image of a huge spaceship appeared, floating and turning so everyone could see it. "This is the newest Zephyrian battleship, the Stellar Harmony," the professor said with pride. "Notice how the hull curves follow the natural flow of energy. Every line serves both beauty and function." The ship was beautiful. It looked more like a work of art than a weapon of war. Its surface was smooth and flowing, with no sharp edges anywhere. Soft blue light ran along lines carved into its hull. Professor Veltar waved another hand, and different ships appeared. Each one represented a different species. The Nexari ship looked like it was made from a single massive diamond, with perfect geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. The Vrak vessel looked alive, with organic curves and what might have been breathing holes along its sides. The ethereal ship seemed to fade in and out of sight, as if it existed only partly in their reality. "Each design represents thousands of years of development," Professor Veltar explained. "Each species has created ships that match their natural strengths." Marcus raised his hand. The floating chair felt strange under him, but he tried to focus on the lesson. "Yes, Lieutenant Chen? Professor, I have a question about the Zephyrian ship. Please, ask freely. Questions help us all learn." Marcus pointed at the image of the Stellar Harmony. "Why is your battleship missing armor here?" The entire class went quiet. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Every alien student turned to look at him. Some of the crystal beings made a sound like wind chimes. A few of the bug-like Vrak clicked their mandibles together. Professor Veltar's 4 arms moved in. What Marcus would later learn was surprise. "Missing armor? I do not understand your question." Marcus stood up and walked closer to the floating image. He pointed to a section near the back of the ship, where the hull seemed to have an opening. "Here, near what looks like the reactor, there's a gap in the armor plating." "Ah," Professor Veltar said, and his voice had a tone that adults used when explaining simple things to children. "That is not missing armor, Lieutenant Chen. That is a thermal exhaust port. All ships require them." But what if someone shoots at it? A few students made sounds that Marcus realized was laughter. A crystal being near the front of the class spoke up. Her voice sounded like music. I am Crystalline Song of Victory. The chances of hitting such a small target during space combat are impossibly small. Battles happen across thousands of kilometers. Ships move at incredible speeds. Even our most advanced targeting systems cannot achieve such precision. A Vrak student, his insect features clicking in amusement, added his own thoughts. I am Hive Warrior 7. My people share one mind across our entire species. We can coordinate our ships perfectly. Even we cannot hit targets so precisely during the chaos of battle. Marcus looked around the room. Every face showed the same expression. Patient amusement at the primitive human's silly question. But, Marcus said slowly, what if they do hit it? Professor Veltar made a gesture with his hands that seemed dismissive. Then the ship would be destroyed, of course. But as my students have explained, such accuracy is impossible. On human ships, Marcus said, we don't have any weak spots like that. The room became even quieter than before. Professor Veltar's large eyes focused on Marcus with new interest. Show us, the professor said. Marcus felt every eye in the room watching him as he walked to the control panel. His hands shook slightly as he accessed the human ship database. When the image appeared above the desk, he heard several students gasp. The human heavy cruiser UES Wellington looked nothing like the elegant alien ships. It was angular and brutal, covered in thick armor plating. Where the alien ships flowed like water or grew like living things, the human ship looked like it had been built to survive a war. Where are the thermal exhaust ports? Asked Crystalline Song of Victory. We don't have any, Marcus replied. The silence stretched on until Professor Veltar finally spoke. How do you manage reactor heat without exhaust ports? Marcus smiled for the first time since entering the classroom. That's a very good question, Professor. Professor Veltar studied the image of the human warship for a long moment. His four arms moved in patterns that Marcus was beginning to recognize as deep thinking. Finally, he spoke. Your ship design appears very solid, the professor said carefully. But, without thermal exhaust ports, how does your reactor avoid overheating during combat operations? Marcus walked closer to the floating image of the Wellington. We use internal cooling systems. Liquid metal coolant flows through channels inside the armor. When it gets hot, it moves to cooling chambers deep inside the ship. The heat gets turned into extra power for weapons or shields. But that is impossible, said Hive Warrior 7, his insect features clicking rapidly. The cooling systems would add enormous weight. The ship would be too slow and clumsy for combat. Human ships are slower than yours, Marcus admitted, but we can take a lot more damage. Crystalline Song of Victory made a sound like breaking glass, which Marcus was learning meant confusion. Why would you accept such a trade? Speed and maneuverability are life in space combat. A fast ship that can avoid being hit is better than a slow ship that can survive being hit. Marcus looked around the room at all the alien faces watching him. How could he explain something that seemed so obvious to any human? What if you can't avoid being hit? He asked. Then you die, said a floating ethereal student, whose voice sounded like wind. That is why we design our ships to avoid damage, not absorb it. But what if the enemy is smarter than you expected? What if they predict where you're going to move? What if they're lucky? And Professor Veltar made a gesture that seemed frustrated. Lieutenant Chen, you are describing scenarios that rarely happen. Galactic naval warfare has been studied for thousands of years. We know the optimal strategies. Random chance plays a very small role in properly conducted battles. Marcus felt that familiar feeling in his stomach, the one he got when he knew he was about to say something that would make everyone angry or confused. But he had to try to make them understand. Professor, could you show us some footage from recent coalition battles? Certainly. Professor Veltar waved a hand. and the air above his desk changed. Now it showed a recording of a space battle between coalition ships and some alien vessels Marcus didn't recognize. The battle was beautiful and terrible at the same time. The coalition ships moved like dancers, flowing around each other in perfect formations. Their weapons fired in coordinated patterns that painted the space around them with brilliant colors. The enemy ships exploded one after another, unable to match the precise tactics of the coalition fleet. This battle took place 6 months ago, Professor Veltar explained. Notice how the coalition ships maintain proper distance and use coordinated fire patterns. The enemy was defeated because they used primitive tactics. Marcus watched the recording again. The room became quiet again. Professor Veltar's eyes narrowed slightly. I am not certain we have access to human combat footage. Well, Crute. Well, I have some on my personal tablet, Marcus said. It's from the war with the Orion Empire, about 10 years ago. He connected his device to the classroom system. The air above the professor's desk flickered, and then filled with a very different kind of battle. The first thing Marcus heard was gasping from several students. The human ships moved nothing like the graceful coalition vessels. They tumbled and rolled through space, their movements seeming random and desperate. But their weapons never stopped firing, and every shot hit exactly where it was aimed. In the recording, human ships were taking terrible damage. Marcus watched a cruiser that had lost half its hull continue fighting, its weapons still tracking targets with perfect precision, even as atmosphere and debris poured from its wounds. How are they still shooting? Whispered Crystalline's song of victory. That ship should be dead. On the screen, a human destroyer deliberately flew into the path of enemy fire, using its own hull to protect a damaged carrier. The destroyer's armor held, and the carrier escaped. The destroyer then turned and destroyed 3 enemy ships with a weapon that fired from what should have been a fatal wound in its side. Redundancy, Marcus explained quietly. Every important system has backups. If one gun gets destroyed, another one takes over. If the main power plant gets hit, backup reactors kick in. If the bridge gets destroyed, engineering takes command. Hive Warrior 7 made rapid clicking sounds. But the weight! The complexity! How do your ships move at all? Carefully, Marcus said. Human ships aren't fast or elegant, but they keep fighting when other ships would be dead. The battle recording continued. Marcus watched the alien students' faces as they saw human gunners hit tiny targets while their own ships spun out of control. He saw their shock when human ships continued operating with damage that should have destroyed them completely. The enemy fleet in the recording began to retreat. The human ships, battered and bleeding atmosphere, continued to fire until the last enemy vessel jumped to hyperspace. How did they achieve such accuracy while maneuvering so violently? Asked Professor Veltar. His voice had lost its earlier confidence. Marcus paused the recording. Human gunners train differently than yours. We practice shooting at small targets, while our ships are deliberately put into uncontrolled spins. We train in conditions where everything that can go wrong does go wrong. Why? Asked the ethereal student. Because, in a real battle, that's what happens. Professor Veltar stood silently for a moment. These tactics, they are very different from standard coalition doctrine. Yes, sir. Your ships sacrifice speed and elegance for survivability. Yes, sir. And your gunners train for scenarios that our tactical manuals consider impossible. Yes, sir. Professor Veltar looked at the frozen image of the human battle. Damaged ships continuing to fight. Weapons firing with impossible accuracy. Crews refusing to give up even when their ships were falling apart around them. Lieutenant Chen, the professor said slowly, I would like to arrange a simulation battle. Your human designs against our best coalition ships. Would you be willing to demonstrate your tactics? Marcus felt that knot in his stomach get tighter. Yes? The battle footage I just showed you? The human fleet was outnumbered 4-1. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the air circulation systems humming in the walls. And they won, Professor Veltar said quietly. Yes, sir, they always do. The simulation chamber was the size of a small stadium. Marcus stood at the center, surrounded by holographic displays that showed every angle of the virtual battlefield. Around him, 30 of the Academy's best students prepared their ships for what Professor Veltar had called an educational exercise. Marcus felt sick to his stomach. This had gotten much bigger than he wanted. Word had spread through the Academy, and now, senior officers and other professors filled the observation deck above them. He could see Admiral Thekmore, the Academy's commander, watching with 3 of his massive eyes while the 4th studied a data tablet. Lieutenant Chen, Professor Veltar announced, you will command 3 human vessels against 9 coalition ships. The scenario is a standard fleet engagement in open space. Marcus looked at his controls. The Academy had somehow gotten perfect copies of human ship designs. His flagship was a heavy cruiser like the Wellington, supported by a destroyer and a fast attack ship. Facing him were 9 of the Coalition's finest vessels, commanded by students who had never lost a simulation battle. Before we begin, Marcus said, I should explain something about human military thinking. Professor Veltar gestured for him to continue. Humans have a rule we call Murphy's Law. It says that if something can go wrong, it will go wrong. At the worst possible moment. Hive Warrior 7 clicked his mandibles in amusement. That seems unnecessarily pessimistic. Maybe, Marcus said. But we design everything, assuming that our enemies are smarter than us, luckier than us, and that our own equipment will break down when we need it most. Crystaline's song of victory made her musical laugh sound. How do you ever accomplish anything with such negative thinking? Marcus looked up at the observation deck, where Admiral Thekmore was now watching him with all 4 eyes. We prepare for the worst-case scenario. That way, when things go wrong, we're ready. Impossible, said an ethereal student. No species can prepare for every possible failure. Marcus touched his control panel, and information about human battle doctrine appeared on the main display. We don't prepare for every failure. We prepare for all failures happening at the same time. The alien students studied the information, their expressions growing more confused. Human ships carried 3 times as many backup systems as coalition vessels. Human crews trained for scenarios where nothing worked properly. Human weapons were designed to fire, even if the targeting computers failed. The power systems were damaged, and the ship was spinning out of control. Professor Veltar looked troubled. This level of redundancy must be incredibly expensive. How do humans afford to build such ships? We build fewer ships, Marcus explained, but each one can do the job of 3 coalition vessels. That cannot be correct, protested a Vrock student. More ships are always better than fewer ships. Marcus smiled sadly. That's what the Orion Empire thought too. The simulation began without warning. Marcus barely had time to grab his controls before the coalition ships appeared on his sensors. They moved in a perfect formation, approaching his small fleet with textbook precision. Marcus did something that made every alien student gasp in horror. He ordered his ships to separate, breaking formation completely. The cruiser accelerated straight toward the enemy fleet, while the destroyer and attack ship moved to flanking positions. He's sacrificing unit cohesion, someone whispered in the observation deck. His ships can't support each other now, added another voice. Marcus watched the coalition ships react exactly as he expected. They maintained their perfect formation and concentrated fire on his cruiser, the largest threat. Energy beams and missiles filled the space around his flagship. But the cruiser didn't explode. Its armor held, and its shields absorbed what the armor couldn't stop. When the smoke cleared, the coalition students saw something that shouldn't have been possible. The human ship was still coming, its weapons now in range. Marcus's first salvo was devastating. While the coalition ships had been focusing on coordinated patterns, the human cruiser had been targeting individual weak points. 3 coalition vessels died in the first exchange, their reactors overloading as precisely aimed shots found their thermal exhaust ports. Impossible targeting, breathed Admiral Thekmore from the observation deck. The remaining coalition ships tried to scatter, but it was too late. Marcus's destroyer had moved into position behind them, while his attack ship came at them from above. The human ships didn't maintain elegant formations, but they didn't need to. Each vessel was deadly on its own. A Nexari student tried to use his ship's superior maneuverability to avoid the human destroyer's guns. He succeeded for almost 30 seconds, his crystalline vessel dancing through space in patterns too complex for normal targeting systems to track. Then the destroyer fired a spread of missiles that seemed to predict exactly where the Nexari ship would be. The explosion was brief and bright. How did they know where I was going to move? The Nexari student asked, his crystal body flickering with distress. Marcus spoke without taking his eyes off his controls. Humans are very good at predicting behavior patterns. We've been hunting each other for thousands of years. The simulation continued, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The coalition ships fought bravely and skillfully, but their elegant tactics meant nothing against an enemy that ignored the rules of civilized warfare. When the last coalition ship exploded, Marcus found himself alone in a debris field, commanding 3 heavily damaged but still functional human vessels. The silence in the simulation chamber was complete. Finally, Admiral Thekmore spoke from the observation deck. His voice carried clearly in the quiet room. Again. Sir? Marcus asked. Run the simulation again. This time, give the coalition force 6-1 numerical advantage. Professor Veltar looked up at his superior. Admiral, surely that would be... Again, the Admiral repeated. Marcus felt sweat on his forehead as he reset his controls. This time, 18 coalition ships appeared on his sensors. The odds were impossible. He won anyway. By the time the Admiral called for a third simulation, with 9-1 odds, every alien in the chamber was staring at Marcus like he was some kind of strange animal they'd never seen before. Marcus lost that one. Barely. Interesting, Admiral Thekmore said as he descended from the observation deck. His massive form towered over Marcus, but his voice was thoughtful rather than threatening. Tell me, Lieutenant Chen, what would happen if we gave human training to coalition crews? Marcus considered the question carefully. Why not? Marcus looked around the room at all the alien faces watching him. Because you're not paranoid enough. You've been winning wars for so long that you've forgotten what it's like to be afraid of losing. Admiral Thekmore studied Marcus for a long moment. And, humans remember? Humans remember, Marcus said quietly. We remember what it's like to be prey. A.M. 2 men. A.M. 2 men. A.M. Word of the simulation spread through the academy faster than Marcus had thought possible. Within hours, students from other classes were coming to stare at him in the hallways. Some looked curious, others seemed afraid, and a few appeared angry. Marcus tried to eat lunch alone, but Crystalline's song of victory found him in the dining hall. She sat across from him, her crystal body catching the light from the room's windows and throwing rainbow patterns on the walls. I have been thinking about your battle tactics, she said without introduction. Marcus swallowed his food and nodded. What about them? You deliberately put your ships in danger. When the coalition fleet focused fire on your cruiser, you could have retreated. Instead, you used your ship as bait. That's right. Why? Marcus set down his eating utensil. How could he explain something that seemed so natural to him? Because sacrifice is sometimes necessary. The cruiser could survive the damage. The smaller ships couldn't. So the cruiser took the hits to protect them. Crystalline Song of Victory's body flickered with colors Marcus didn't recognize. But what if your calculations were wrong? What if the cruiser had been destroyed? What if your matters? Crystalline Song of Victory's body. What if the cruiser had been destroyed? 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 Then the destroyer and attack ship would have avenged it. That is not logical. If you lose ships unnecessarily, you weaken your fleet. Marcus looked around the dining hall. Students from a dozen species sat at tables, eating foods he couldn't identify, speaking languages that sounded like music, or wind, or breaking stone. They all seemed so confident, so sure that the universe made sense. "Can I tell you something about human history?" he asked. She nodded. "For most of our existence, humans weren't the strongest species on our planet. We weren't the fastest, or the biggest, or the most dangerous. We survived because we were willing to sacrifice ourselves for each other. A human parent will die to save their child. Human soldiers will die to save their comrades. Human ship crews will die to save their fleet. But that reduces your survival chances as individuals." "Yes. But it increases our survival chances as a species." Crystalline Song of Victory was quiet for a moment. "Is that why human weapons are so accurate? Because you assume you might only get one shot before you die?" Marcus nodded. "Every shot might be your last chance to protect someone you care about." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Veltar and Admiral Thekmore. The dining hall went silent as the two senior officers approached Marcus's table. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Thekmore said, "I would like you to participate in another exercise." "What kind of exercise, sir?" "A real-time combat simulation against actual Coalition fleet officers. They have requested the opportunity to test their skills against human tactics." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Sir, I'm just a student. I'm not qualified to—" "You are qualified," the Admiral interrupted. "The question is whether you are willing." Marcus looked at the faces around him. Every student in the dining hall was watching. He could see excitement, fear, and challenge in their expressions. "What are the terms?" he asked. Admiral Thekmore smiled, which was a disturbing sight on his massive face. 5 Coalition heavy cruisers, commanded by our most experienced captains, against 3 human vessels, commanded by you. And if I refuse? Then everyone will assume that human tactics only work against students." Marcus understood the trap he was in. If he refused, it would look like cowardice. If he accepted and lost, it would prove that human methods were inferior. If he accepted and won, it would change everything. "I accept," he said. The simulation chamber had been expanded for the demonstration. Instead of holographic displays, they had built actual command bridges for each ship. Marcus found himself on a perfect replica of a human cruiser bridge, complete with the smell of recycled air and the hum of machinery that never quite worked perfectly. His crew was made up of academy instructors who had volunteered to help. They looked nervous but determined as they took their positions at the various control stations. Through the main screen, Marcus could see the Coalition fleet approaching. 5 massive ships, each one larger and more powerful than anything in his fleet. They moved in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the kind of polish that spoke of crews who took enormous pride in their vessels. "Sir," his tactical officer called out. "Enemy ships are maintaining standard approach pattern. They're keeping optimal distance for coordinated fire." Marcus nodded. The Coalition commanders were doing exactly what their training told them to do. They were following thousands of years of tactical doctrine that had never failed them. "All ships," Marcus broadcast to his small fleet, "implement Murphy Protocol 7. His crew looked confused. Murphy Protocol 7 wasn't a real thing. Marcus had just made it up. But it sounded official. And in the confusion of battle, Sometimes confidence mattered more than actual knowledge. What Marcus actually did was order his ships to do something that violated every rule of space combat. Instead of maintaining formation, he ordered them to accelerate directly toward the enemy fleet at maximum speed, with no regard for mutual support or tactical positioning. The coalition commanders must have thought he had lost his mind. Marcus's cruiser reached the enemy formation first, absorbing massive amounts of fire from all 5 coalition ships. His shields failed, his armor began to glow red-hot, and alarms started screaming throughout the bridge. But the ship held together. While the coalition fleet was focused on his cruiser, Marcus's destroyer and attack ship reached their flanks. The destroyer targeted the coalition flagship's thermal exhaust port with a precision shot that caused a reactor cascade. The attack ship put a torpedo into another enemy vessel's shield generator, leaving it defenseless. 2 coalition ships died in the first 30 seconds of combat. The remaining 3 ships tried to adjust their tactics, but they were thinking like civilized beings who fought by rules. Marcus was thinking like a human who expected everything to go wrong. When the coalition ships tried to use their superior speed to create distance, Marcus's damaged cruiser released a spread of missiles that had been hidden in its debris field. The missiles were simple and stupid, but there were dozens of them, and they forced the coalition ships to maneuver into the path of Marcus's other vessels. When the coalition ships tried to coordinate a joint attack, Marcus's destroyer deliberately rammed one of them, using its heavily armored hull as a weapon, while its guns continued firing at point-blank range. When the last coalition ship tried to retreat, Marcus's attack ship caught it with a weapon that shouldn't have been able to fire after the damage it had taken. The simulation ended with 3 human vessels, all heavily damaged but still functional, floating alone in a field of wreckage. Admiral Thekmore's voice came over the communication system. Simulation complete. Final score: humans, 5. Coalition, 0. The bridge was silent, except for the sound of cooling metal and sparking electronics. Marcus slumped in his command chair, exhausted by the intensity of the battle. "Sir?" his tactical officer asked quietly. "What's Murphy Protocol 7? Marcus managed a tired smile. "It means we assume everything will go wrong, and we fight anyway." Later, in the debriefing room, the coalition captains who had commanded the enemy ships sat in stunned silence. These were experienced officers, veterans of dozens of battles, and they had been defeated by a student using tactics that shouldn't have worked. Captain Zareth, a Zephyrian who had commanded the flagship, finally spoke. "Your ships should have been destroyed in the first minute of combat. How did your cruiser survive concentrated fire from 5 heavy vessels?" Marcus looked tired. "Human ships are built to absorb punishment. We assume that we're going to get hit, so we design our armor and shields to handle it." "But your tactical decisions made no sense," protested another captain. "You deliberately put your ships in danger." "I put my ships where they could do the most damage to you," Marcus corrected. "The danger was acceptable, because the ships could survive it." Admiral Thekmore leaned forward in his chair. "Lieutenant Chen, I want you to explain something to me. How does a species develop such pessimistic military thinking?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking about Earth, about the long history of wars and conflicts that had shaped human thinking, about the fact that humans had spent most of their existence fighting each other. "Admiral," he said finally, "humans aren't pessimistic. We're realistic. We know that the universe doesn't care about us, that our enemies will be smart and lucky and determined. We know that our equipment will fail, and our plans will go wrong, and our people will make mistakes. And yet you continue to fight. We continue to fight because that's what humans do. We don't fight because we think we'll win. We fight because the alternative is surrender." Admiral Thekmore studied Marcus for a long moment. "And that philosophy has never failed you?" Marcus thought about the human colonies that had been lost to various threats over the years, about the battles that had been won at terrible cost, about the fact that humanity was still the newest member of the coalition, still struggling to find its place among species that had been spacefaring for millennia. It's failed us plenty of times, Marcus admitted. But we're still here. 3 months later, Marcus stood in front of a classroom that looked very different from the one where he had first asked his question about missing armor. The elegant floating chairs had been replaced with practical seats that could be locked in place during emergency drills. The beautiful holographic displays now showed damage control procedures alongside tactical formations. Most importantly, the students looked different too. Crystallina's song of victory no longer sat perfectly straight and still. She hunched over her data tablet, making notes about worst-case scenarios and backup plans. Hive Warrior 7 had started questioning his hive mind's tactical decisions, asking what would happen if the mental link failed during battle. Even the ethereal students had begun practicing combat maneuvers in solid form, just in case their phase-shifting abilities stopped working. Marcus wasn't teaching the class. Professor Veltar still held that honor. But Marcus had been made an assistant instructor, a title that made him uncomfortable every time someone used it. He was supposed to be learning, not teaching. Today we will discuss redundant systems design, Professor Veltar announced. His forearms moved with less confidence than they had months earlier. Marcus's demonstrations had shaken the professor's faith in traditional coalition engineering. A new student raised her hand. She was a Nexari, her crystal body already showing the stress fractures that came from too much time studying worst-case scenarios. Professor, I've been working on modifications to the standard thermal exhaust system. What if we added emergency shutters that could close during combat? Professor Veltar nodded approvingly. Show us your design. The student activated the holographic display, and Marcus felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. The ship that appeared looked nothing like the elegant Nexari vessels from his first day. It was angular and practical, covered in armor with no obvious weak points. It was starting to look human. The emergency shutters would trap heat inside the ship during battle, the student explained. The crew would have to endure dangerous temperatures, but the ship would survive long enough to complete its mission. Marcus watched Professor Veltar study the design. The old teacher's expression showed the same conflict Marcus felt. The ship was better protected, more likely to survive combat, but it had lost something beautiful in the process. Very good, Professor Veltar said finally. What about crew survival during the overheating period? End quote. Emergency cooling suits, the student replied. And medical treatment for heat exposure after combat ends. Another hand went up. This time it was a Vrak student, whose shell was already showing scars from the new physical training requirements. What if the enemy targets the cooling suits? Marcus felt his heart sink as he listened to the question. A few months ago, that same student had been laughing at human paranoia. Now he was asking about secondary targeting priorities and equipment vulnerabilities. Backup suits, the Nexari student answered without hesitation. And backups. Class continued with discussions of triple redundant power systems, armor that could self-repair during combat, and weapons that could fire even when their targeting computers were destroyed. Every topic was approached with the assumption that anything that could go wrong would go wrong. After class, Marcus found himself walking with Professor Veltar toward the Academy's communication center. They had both been summoned for a priority message from Coalition Command. I am troubled by what we are becoming, Professor Veltar said as they walked. Marcus looked at his teacher, surprised by the admission. What do you mean? Look at my students. Look at their designs. Everything they create now assumes defeat, assumes failure, assumes that the universe is hostile and unforgiving. Isn't it? Professor Veltar stopped walking. His forearms made gestures that Marcus had learned indicated deep philosophical conflict. Perhaps, but there was beauty in our old ways. Grace, elegance. We designed ships that were works of art as well as tools of war. Marcus thought about the human ships in Earth's fleet. Ugly, practical things that looked like they had been beaten with hammers. Beauty doesn't stop enemy missiles. No, Professor Veltar agreed. But survival without beauty may not be worth the cost. They reached the communication center, where Admiral Thekmore was waiting with a collection of senior officers Marcus didn't recognize. The Admiral's expression was grim as they entered. "Gentlemen," Admiral Thekmore said, "we have received disturbing news from the outer systems." The main display activated, showing a map of Coalition space. At the edge of the map, several star systems were marked with red warning symbols. 3 weeks ago, we lost contact with the Kepler 438 system, the Admiral continued. 2 days later, Ross 128 went silent. Yesterday, we received a partial transmission from Wolf 359 before their communications array was destroyed. Marcus felt ice in his stomach. "What's attacking them?" Admiral Thekmore gestured to another officer, who activated a new display. The screen showed grainy footage from what looked like a ship's final moments. Through the static and interference, Marcus could see enemy vessels unlike anything in Coalition databases. The attacking ships were brutal and efficient. They had no obvious weak points, no thermal exhaust ports, no elegant design features. They looked like they had been designed by engineers who assumed their enemies would exploit any vulnerability they could find. They looked human. "We are calling them the Devourers," Admiral Thekmore said. "They appeared without warning and have been advancing through our territory with military precision. Every fleet we send against them is destroyed." Professor Veltar's forearms moved in patterns Marcus now recognized as fear. "How many ships have we lost?" 47 vessels in 3 separate engagements. None of our ships have survived long enough to gather detailed tactical data. Marcus studied the footage more carefully. The enemy ships moved with the same ruthless efficiency he had seen in human battle recordings. They targeted weak points with devastating accuracy. They coordinated their attacks to prevent enemy retreat. They showed no mercy and took no prisoners. "Admiral," Marcus said quietly, "these ships, they're designed using human principles." "What do you mean?" "No weak points, maximum armor, weapons designed for precision targeting. Whoever built these ships thinks the same way humans do about warfare." The room was silent as the implications sank in. Somewhere in the galaxy, another species had developed the same paranoid, pessimistic approach to war that had made humans so effective. Admiral Thekmore turned to face Marcus directly. "Lieutenant Chen, I am recalling you to active duty. Coalition Command has requested that human tactical advisors be assigned to every major fleet." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Sir, I'm not qualified to." "You are the most qualified person in Coalition space for this type of warfare," the Admiral interrupted. "Your people understand enemies who think like these Devourers." "What about my studies here?" Professor Veltar spoke up. "Your studies are complete, Lieutenant. You have taught us more than we have taught you." Marcus looked around the room at the alien faces watching him. 3 months ago, he had been a confused student, asking simple questions about ship design. Now, he was being asked to help defend an entire civilization. "There's something else," Admiral Thekmore said. "We're not just assigning human advisors to our fleets. We're redesigning our ships using human engineering principles. Every Coalition vessel is being retrofitted with redundant systems, improved armor, and weapons designed for precision targeting." Marcus felt a strange sadness at the words. The beautiful, elegant ships that had first amazed him were disappearing, replaced by practical, ugly vessels designed for survival rather than aesthetics. "Admiral," Marcus said, "what if we're wrong? What if human tactics don't work against these Devourers?" Admiral Thekmore's massive face showed something Marcus had never seen before. Hope, mixed with determination. "Then we will adapt again," the Admiral said. "That is what your people have taught us, Lieutenant. When faced with an impossible enemy, humans don't surrender. They learn." A week later, Marcus stood on the bridge of the Coalition flagship Eternal Harmony, watching the fleet prepare for departure. Around him, Ships that had once been graceful works of art now bristled with armor and weapons. Their crews had been training in human combat doctrine, learning to expect the worst and fight anyway. Marcus touched his communication console and opened a channel to the human ships that had joined the fleet. His own people, come to fight alongside their former enemies against a threat that neither species could face alone. All ships, Marcus broadcast. This is Lieutenant Chen. We are about to face an enemy that thinks like us, fights like us, and wants to destroy everything we protect. They expect us to be afraid. Luces. He paused, looking out at the stars ahead of them. They're right to expect that. We are afraid. But fear has never stopped humans before, and it won't stop us now. The fleet jumped to hyperspace, carrying human paranoia and alien courage toward a war that would decide the fate of two civilizations. In his quarters later, Marcus found a message waiting for him. It was from Crystaline's Song of Victory, who had graduated early and was now serving as a tactical officer on a Nexari cruiser. Marcus, her message read, I wanted to thank you for the question you asked on your first day. You asked why our ships had weak points, and we thought it was a stupid question. Now I understand that it was the most important question anyone had ever asked. Marcus smiled sadly as he deleted the message. He had asked a simple question about missing armor, and it had changed an entire civilization's approach to warfare. He just hoped they weren't too late.